'Cause baby, you were born to win.
Yes, and thank you for hanging out with us in the May track. We've officially started, yay! So we are kicking off with Heather Barr. Thank you for joining us, Heather. Heather is co-director of Human Rights Watch, and she's done research in countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, and Papua New Guinea on issues like child marriage, violence against women, and after. Well, you joined Human Rights Watch in 2011 as the Afghanistan researcher. And after working for United Nations in Afghanistan and Burundi. After law school, she legislated for discharge planning for prisoners with psychological disabilities in New York City. And founded Alternative to Incineration program. And before law school, she worked with homeless women. She's a graduate of a London School of Economics, Columbia Law School, and John Jay College for Criminal Justice. Wow. Thank you so much for joining us. And
shorten that.
but for the people not familiar with Human Rights Watch, so what does Human Rights Watch actually do? And I can read what you do, but can you explain this in more detail, what you actually do there?
Sure. No, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's I think it's the first time I've ever attended a tech conference, so it's very cool to be here. So Human Rights Watch documents human rights abuses and then advocates to try to end them. So we work on about 90 different countries. We don't deliver services. What we do is poke around and find out what's going on and find proof and documentation of human rights abuses, and then publish that in the form of reports and shorter documents, all of which you can find on our website, which is hrw.org. And then we take that evidence and we go to governments or sometimes to companies and we say, look, this is not right. This has to end. So that's the work that we do. Thank you. I see the website.
and I hope that this certainly will not be the last tech conference, because we have to be aware of issues happening in the world. And it's cool to talk about technology, but this is also a side of what's happening out there in the world. Now, you are here to talk about a report. Can you tell me a little bit about this report?
Sure. So this is a new report that I've written, and it is not out yet. I hope it's going to come out in maybe May or June, because we have a very long review process. We have to make sure that we have every single fact exactly right, and that means that a lot of people review a report before it's finished. But this report is about something that's happening in South Korea, which people call digital sex crimes. And so this is a term that people might not be familiar with. Sometimes people are more familiar with talking about online gender-based violence. And online gender-based violence is quite a broad category, which can include all kinds of things, including sort of harassment and so on. But digital sex crimes is sort of a smaller set of abuses that involves images. So there's sort of three different categories as we think of it. People who have had their image, usually an intimate image, a nude image, or a sexual image in some way, captured without their consent. Or people who have had an image of themselves shared without their consent, even if they might have consented to that image being created, they didn't consent to it being shared. Or it could be an image that's actually been faked. So someone's created an image where they've taken someone's head and stuck it on a naked body. And those images sometimes are used by people who are impersonating someone to try to harm their reputation or their personal life, their employment, their access to education, and so on.
So maybe we can also talk about it. Why exactly you decided to choose this topic to conduct the research?
So I had been following the women's rights situation in South Korea for a while because there had been a lot of interesting things going on in South Korea. Particularly, there was a big Supreme Court lawsuit about the abortion law, and some interesting things happening. And so in about 2015, I started reading news reports that talked about tiny cameras being hidden in toilets. And so people filming women and girls while they were using the toilet and then selling that footage. And I think this has become less surprising since then, because it's become more widespread. But, those years ago, I thought, what is this? I'd never heard of such a thing before. I couldn't imagine that there would actually be a market for this footage, that anyone would pay to buy this footage or pay to watch it. And so I followed the issue for a while, and then we decided that it was important enough, and it was something that was having a huge impact on the lives of women and girls in South Korea, and also was something that was beginning to spread to other countries as well. And so we wanted to think about, what does human rights law say about this issue? What should governments be doing in order to respect their obligations under international human rights law to protect women from things like a tiny camera in a toilet stall?
Because there were, not every country was yet prepared for this to happen, or?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any country in the world that's really prepared for this. I think that, legislative processes are quite slow. Legislators are usually old men, frankly. So they might not know a ton about tech, and they might not be that sensitive to, why it would really, upset people to think that they might be being filmed every time they go in a public toilet. It's not in their toilet, is it? So I think, and it is challenging. I mean, to be fair to politicians, as I'm sure both of you know, people are very creative in how they use technology, and what they get up to on the internet, for good and for bad. And so I think what we've seen in a lot of places, including South Korea, is that they pass some laws to try to deal with this new problem, and by the time they get those laws passed, there's some new problem that isn't covered. And so, for example, I think the law in South Korea, it originally criminalized sharing an image that you had taken without consent, but it didn't criminalize sharing an image that was taken with consent. So there are all these sort of different loopholes that kept appearing in the law, and they've had to go back and fix it over and over again. And I actually think that South Korea, in some ways, has been forced to be a leader on this issue because it's become such a big problem there. And so there are some things that other countries should learn from what South Korea has done, including, one thing they've done that's really important is they set up a whole center to assist survivors of this abuse. And what they mostly help with is trying to get internet companies to remove the images, because that's really difficult for individual people to do on their own, especially if you're in South Korea and you're trying to deal with a company that has headquarters on the other side of the planet, might not really speak the language that you speak. And the stories that we heard from survivors about their experiences trying to get companies to remove images of them were not very happy stories for the most part. So
Yes, I can totally understand. And of course, once you did this report, you conduct a lot of research to hear all of this story. Can you share us a little bit how that research actually was going?
Yeah, sure. So it was very different from the research that I usually do at Human Rights Watch. As Suzanne said, I've done lots of research on girls' education, child marriage, domestic violence, and usually that involves sort of, lots of walking around in muddy sandals with a notebook, going around different villages and interviewing people. And this was quite different, and much harder in a way, because I think people who've experienced digital sex crimes, often what's happened, sometimes they've been targeted by a stranger, but sometimes they've been betrayed by someone they really trusted. Sometimes it was situations where, somebody discovers that their their boyfriend, their partner, their husband even has taken photographs of them without them knowing, maybe while they were sleeping, or, you know, with a silent camera when they weren't looking. And then those photographs have been shared somehow, or even if they haven't been shared, just the fact that someone's photographed them without consent. So people were really, really traumatized, and it was quite difficult to find people who were ready to trust a stranger who wanted to hear all the details about their experience. So one of the ways that we actually looked for people to interview was we did a survey to ask people about their experiences with this issue, and that was really interesting. We got 554 responses in just a month or two from people, almost all of whom said that they had experienced this type of abuse. And then from that, we got some people who were ready to actually be interviewed and tell their story. And the stories were horrendous. I mean, one story that I found particularly strange was the woman who her boss gave her a clock. I think maybe she'd said something about she didn't have an alarm clock or something, and so he gave her a clock as a gift, and so she put it in her bedroom at home. And then at some point she moved the clock, and then her boss made a comment that she found strange, you know, about, you know, oh, if you don't want the clock anymore, I'll take it back or something. And she thought, you know, that's really weird. And so she spent all this time on the internet looking to see if she could find that clock. And that was a really hard task, because if you do a search for like clock hidden camera, you get millions of hits. But she managed to actually find this clock, and sure enough, it was a camera. And it had been streaming everything that was happening inside her bedroom to her boss's telephone for weeks and weeks. So, and then I'll just tell you one other story, which was about a woman who, and this is a story about faked images. This is someone who had broken up with her partner, and he was really not handling it very well. And he created fake images of her and posted, like, nude images with her face, and posted them on every platform you can think of, every social media platform you can think of, with all of her contact details, where she worked and where she lived and what her phone number was, and information about her parents, all kinds of stuff. And then messages saying things like, oh, I'm trying so hard to find someone to have sex with me. And so she actually had men coming to her work looking for her. And she had to quit her job, and she had to flee her home. So that's just an example. And I think it's important to tell that story, because one of the challenges I think we have, because legislators are mostly men, is that people really don't understand the impact of these crimes. They think somebody posted a picture of you, you know, who cares, whatever. They don't understand that once something's on the internet, it's there forever. They don't understand that this can actually, like, you know, completely disrupt your entire life, your access to education, your access to employment, your housing, your relationships with your family. So some of the solutions that we think are important. I mean, we don't think that you can solve this problem by putting everyone in jail. I mean, of course, we want to see tough penalties for people who engage in these kinds of crimes, but it's much more important to try and prevent this behavior. And so one of the things that there's not much of in South Korea is really good sexuality education and education about digital citizenship. I think that you have to teach kids that, you know, about consent, about healthy relationships, about sexual violence, and about, you know, what you can and can't do with technology. And I don't know if there are any countries that are doing a very good job right now of teaching that to children. Maybe the two of you would know better than I do. But certainly I think you can't solve this problem without changing people's behavior, because right now it feels like these images, it's kind of normal to consume them, and it's kind of a male bonding ritual to sort of send them to your friends, and that's really deeply messed up, you know?
Yeah, I read an article the other day in a Dutch magazine here, where somebody indeed, explained what it can do to a person. Like, it was many years ago, but she still suffered from this and trying to process what happened. It is, those are stories which immediately grab your heart, because you can understand and imagine how much influence this has. So you mentioned, like, you had quite fast had 500 responders to the survey. Do you have any idea how big this actually is?
Well, I can tell you that in 2008, 4% of all sex crimes in South Korea involved technology. And the total number of cases that year was 585 cases that were sex crimes involving technology. By 2017, that had increased to 20%, and there were 11 times as many cases. So in 2017, there were 6,615 cases. So if you consider the fact that one of the things that we learned is that the police handle these cases so poorly and the sentences are so low that there's very little reason for anyone to report them. So if you consider that those 6,615 cases, that's the number of people who actually decided to report them. And for every one of those people, there must be so many more who just thought, the police won't do anything, he'll just have to pay a fine anyway, which for most of these crimes in South Korea, if you get caught and you're convicted, then your sentence is a fine, and not even necessarily a very large one. So I think, it's impossible to really estimate what the total number is, but it seems like it must be enormous. And you have to consider also that a lot of people don't even know that they've been a victim. So, you were out wandering around, you were out in a restaurant, you went to have a pee in the toilet, there was a tiny hole in the wall that you didn't see. You've got no idea, and I think that that's part of what's really traumatizing for all women in South Korea, is this feeling that their privacy is being violated all the time, or that it might be being violated. And it's made a lot of women feel, really uncomfortable in public spaces and really kind of pushed out of public spaces. So, yeah, it's a big deal.
So one question that I have so you are going to publish this report, and what do you think is going to be the next step after that? What are the action points is going to be?
So when we publish a report, our goal is always to actually end the abuse that's happening. We don't publish a report just to publish a report. So the first thing that we'll do is to try to really talk to the South Korean government, other organizations that work on this issue in South Korea. We hope that our report will be useful to them. We hope that we'll be able to engage with the government directly, and try to get them to move some of these reforms forward. I mean, one other thing that I didn't mention that I think is a really important solution is civil legal remedies. So prosecuting someone, putting them in jail, that's fine, but there are other kinds of legal remedies as well, like being able to sue someone and make them pay for the harm that you've suffered, and make them pay for somebody who's responsible for monitoring the internet and trying to get these images removed. If you had to move house, then the person who did this to you, they should have to pay, for the money that you lost because you had to move house, or because you lost your job, et cetera, et cetera. I think that when people have made profits from these images, as people do because they are monetized online, those profits should all go to the person whose image was stolen and used in this way. So that's another important solution that we would like to push the South Korean government to take on, as well as some of these issues I've talked about digital citizenship education, comprehensive sexuality education. But I also hope that this report might be helpful in trying to get some other governments in other countries to kind of think more about this issue and think more about solutions, and also to try and advance the discussion a bit within the United Nations and other international bodies about what they should be recommending to countries in terms of their obligations under international human rights law when it comes to digital technology and these kinds of image-based abuses.
Yeah, and there's also a question coming from the chat. So about the deepfakes. So how do you even prevent this happening? You just share your picture of your face, and that's enough to create a deepfake. It makes this digital world terribly unsafe. So do you have any advice to share with us?
So I don't think it's gonna, I mean, I'm not a great tech expert, but I don't think it's very realistic to think that we're gonna prevent that type of technology from existing, or that we're gonna get that sort of genie put back in the bottle so that people aren't able to create these deep fakes. And so I think the kinds of solutions we need to look for instead are these kinds of civil liability solutions. It has to be easier to figure out who made that image, who distributed that image, and to come and get them and make them liable for the harm that they've caused to someone. So I don't have super detailed ideas about how that could be done, but I think that that's the kind of approach we need to look at to make online spaces less misogynistic, less dangerous for women, as you say. This is where we're living a big part of our lives now, and that can't be a space that drives women out and makes them feel unsafe all the time.
And you mentioned that, of course, you need to work with the governments, and there need to be legislation about all the consequences and even the education and so on. So how realistic actually you think that this collaboration is happening? As you mentioned, that majority of them, they are old male, and they might not even care about it. So, but what is your progress on that side?
That's the power of really documenting things. When you come to legislators and governments and you have proof, and often that proof is in the form of their own statistics, their own sort of legislative history, combined with these stories from people who've been directly affected by the human rights abuse. We're not always successful, but we often can make some progress. Also because governments find it embarrassing. Our organization is, we're an international organization, sort of working on countries around the world with, a big megaphone in a way. And so I think it's quite embarrassing for governments sometimes when we show up and we say, wow, look what's happening in your country. That's pretty awful,
Yeah, so like exactly in many cases, you need to bring us the visuals to make people to see what exactly happened, then they will start acting. That's true.
I hope so.
Yeah, let's hope so. And so, how can people actually help? Because this is a super pressing issue as well. And it's good that it gets flagged and that there's research and, Human Rights Watch making sure that our governments know what is happening and helping taking action. But what can we do? Maybe people in technology. How can we help Human Rights Watch with this?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking. I think there's work that we can all do in terms of making online spaces safer. I think some of it is just calling out abusive behavior when we see it. If you're on a notice board, if you're in a chat room, just sort of saying something. I had a funny experience today, just spending too much of the day on Twitter, and I still do a lot of work on Afghanistan. And so there was an Afghan think tank, and they posted a notice on Twitter about a panel discussion they're having later this week, which was all men. And so someone else had actually pointed it out to me, but I just wrote a snarky message saying, Happy International Women's Day to everyone except people who are announcing their mammals. And they wrote and apologized and said they were sorry and that they had tried but not hard enough, and they promised to do better in the future. So I think it's quite powerful sometimes if you just publicly embarrass people a little bit. And obviously there are lots of people who are engaging in digital sex crimes or other kinds of misogynistic abuse online, and maybe if we can call them out. I think technology to remove images is super important and super necessary. It's the most important thing to the survivors I interviewed is this feeling that image is there forever, that they can never get rid of it. People talked about things like, they would get one website to take it down, but it would still show up in thumbnails when they did a search for it. So they felt like it was never gone. And they felt like sometimes they would get it taken down, but then it would just reappear again, even though they didn't think that anyone had reposted it. And so the kind of mysteries of image removal on the internet are super important, kind of life or death to people who are experiencing digital sex crimes, who are mostly women, of course. So I think that would be huge if people in tech could help figure that out. One thing I didn't say about this is one of the things that was most upsetting about this research was how many of the women I interviewed talked about having considered suicide. Because I think that this abuse is so endless that you can never kind of close a door on it and move on and start recovering, because you are always thinking it's going to come back again. If you get a new job, that image is going to pop up and your new boss is going to see it. If you go back to university, that image is going to pop up and your classmates are going to see it. So yeah, ways that we can find to make people feel safe again is really important. And this kind of idea about digital citizenship, we need that online. It's not just for kids, it's for everyone in every space, and yeah, companies can do more to, set and enforce standards about what kind of behavior they'll allow on their platforms. And that would matter a lot too.
It should be very horrifying for actually people that they are in such a situation. So if you want to give an advice, because that actually can happen to anyone, any of us that we are talking, you never know. As you just mentioned, you even might not know that such a thing has happened to you. So where do you think that the people should seek help if they are in such a situation? So
there are some different organizations in different countries. In South Korea, there are actually 2 organizations that were working specifically on this issue, and I've heard about other organizations in the UK and in Australia and in Pakistan and some other countries. But one of the challenges is that this issue is not really a national issue, is it? Because it's the internet, and the internet is global. So I don't know. I think it would be great if there were more resources for survivors, sort of regardless of what country they were in. If you're in South Korea, but your photo's been posted on a platform that's headquarters is in California or something, companies can do more. I'd like to see companies actually set up help centers that are really help centers. Like they could be providing sort of counseling and support and legal assistance and so on. Whereas actually the way it works now, what I heard from some survivors is you have to fill out a different form for every single image. So if somebody's posted dozens of images of you, you've got to do a separate form for each one. And then you send it, and sometimes you just get no response at all. So yeah, it would be good to have some kind of borderless assistance for people.
Sure.
Yeah, and that relates also to a question we received on the chat. the question is, I cannot think of anyone who witnessed more digital sex crimes than the people who review the content marked as abusive on Facebook and YouTube. These big tech players play a big role in removing that content, but they also have this multinational reach as opposed to the national reach. So do you explore also the cooperation there?
So I haven't yet, but I definitely think that that's another piece of what we need to do as we prepare for the report to come out. And once it comes out, is we need to talk to the companies that are in this space, and that includes some of the big social media companies, but it also includes pornography websites and gambling websites, and it's interesting. I mean, it becomes tied up with a lot of the complex issues that are going on about governance of the internet, doesn't it? I'm glad I have some colleagues who are more expert in that field than I am, and I'll be looking to them to help me.
And just a question popping up in my mind. So, do you think also that diversity within such companies could also make a difference there?
Of course, it could. I mean, the stereotypes I have about who legislators are, and why it's difficult to get good legislation on this issue. Well, it's the same for tech companies, isn't it? It's not old men, it's young men. But tech companies, we've all seen the statistics about how male-dominated tech companies are, and so perhaps the reason that survivors don't find these mechanisms to try to have an image removed particularly responsive is because the person on the other side of it, or the people on the other side of it, are all men, and they like the legislators can't really understand what the big deal is, and aren't that motivated to sort of make it their mission in life to figure out how to block an image permanently, or how to detect variations on the same image, or how to make sure that that the way that people are treated when they're going through this process and trying to have these images removed is respectful and doesn't traumatize them all over again.
Okay, valid points. I hope people make notes watching this. A, make sure that your company is diverse, and B, I just want to respond to that. No manuals anymore, people. You can't have manuals. It's 2021. Please don't. Don't.
Thank you.
That's true. Hope we get more women in tech finally as well.
Yeah.
And so you also working on many other women's rights issues. So maybe we can talk quickly about that as well. We have about, I guess, 8 minutes left.
Okay, sure. Well, as you all know, this is International Women's Day. And for the last year, a lot of what we've been doing is looking at the impact of the COVID pandemic on women and girls. And it's been a complete disaster. It's set women's rights back by decades, I would say. And there are sort of 4 main areas that we think women have been really affected. The first is employment and economic rights, and that's related to caregiving, because when 1.4 billion children were sent home from school, it wasn't men who looked after most of them. The United Nations has found that women, this was before the pandemic, that women do 2.5 times as much caregiving, unpaid caregiving, as men do. And it seems likely that figure's gone up during the pandemic. So that's been a disaster for a lot of women. And a lot of women had no safety net to catch them when they lost their access to employment. Second is gender-based violence. So you probably saw that reported rates of gender-based violence went up in countries all around the world during the pandemic. People were trapped inside their house with their abuser sometimes without the ability to get out and get help. Then third was access to sexual and reproductive health. So some countries and some states, like in the US, actually took advantage of the pandemic to block access to abortion. Women struggled to get access to contraception. There were even situations where women who were giving birth had difficulty getting to a hospital because the hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID patients, or the lockdown hadn't exempted people who needed to get to a doctor for maternity care. And then the fourth area is girls' education. So obviously all of these 1.4 billion children who are out of school are being harmed by that, but girls are harmed more. And we know that that's the case because when girls are out of school, they're at much higher risk of being forced into a child marriage. And that's a real risk for a lot of girls around the world. They're also often less able to keep up with studying remotely because they end up doing a lot of housework, more than boys do, for all the reasons we already talked about. And they have less access to technology than boys. So to the extent that remote education is reliant on technology, you often see that even in the same family, there might be one device, there might be one computer or tablet, and the boys get to use it and the girls don't. So, I'm sure you're familiar with the data on smartphone ownership, which is lower for women. And that digital gap seems to be becoming, the gender digital gap seems to be becoming larger in some ways, which is really, really concerning. So those are some of the things we've been thinking about in the last year. And, those are long-term issues we've worked on for a long time, but COVID has put them in a new light with increased urgency.
Yeah, that is true. I recently actually read, as you mentioned, that a lot of interviews with people around the world, that this COVID situation actually was way harsher than women for all the reasons that you mentioned there.
Yeah. I mean, the more cheerful thing I would say is that I think that it's made gender inequity much more visible than it was a year ago. I mean, we knew that, there was gender inequality a year ago, but it's made it much worse and more visible, and it's made women very angry. And so I think that we're seeing like a lot of very angry, mobilized women who are going to insist that things get done differently from now on. And it's been very interesting also to see that fewer people died in countries run by women. So I can see some applications of that of that research. Sorry, you were going to say something, Suzanne.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. So this report is coming out. Obviously, well, you share a lot of other topics you're working on at this moment. So how can people stay informed on what's happening, and for instance, when the report is published?
So please, you can check out our website anytime, but we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. Human Rights Watch, I think, was one of the human rights organizations that kind of dove into social media earlier than some others. So we're quite active on all those platforms. YouTube, we have a YouTube channel as well. So we'd be happy to see everyone there in any of those spots.
See, our producer put the website in. That's good. So go to the website and you can stay in touch and be informed when this report gets published, I should say. Good.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess we have 3 minutes left, and if you want to generally give an advice to the people that they are right now watching you about how they can get more information, because the thing is that I know countries are different, but when they want to get more information, to get help or be more aware about their rights as women, so do you have any advice for them to seek help or so?
So I would encourage people to take a look at the women's rights section on our website. So we're divided up into different divisions, and I'm one of the directors at the moment of the women's rights division. And so that's a good place to sort of learn more about what we think are some of the most important women's rights issues in the world at the moment. And I think the most important thing that we want everyone to do with regard to to the situation that we're in right now with the COVID pandemic is we want everyone to be watching as their countries develop recovery plans and watching and harassing all their politicians to make sure that those plans take into account who's been harmed the most during the pandemic. And I've talked about how women have been disproportionately harmed, but it's not just about gender. It's also about people who were living in poverty before the pandemic, people who are marginalized because of issues like race or disability or age. So that differs from country to country, but it's intersectional, as we say, the sort of harm that people suffered. And so we want people to be pushing their governments to make recovery plans that prioritize the people that have been harmed most, and then also try to end the inequities that led to such a difference in how different people have experienced the pandemic. So we want gender equality, racial equality, all of those things. I think we learned, and social safety nets. I think we learned a lot in the last year about what it means when you actually have no social safety net for people and a catastrophe comes along.
That's true. Yeah, thank you very much for all the advice.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. It's the first tech conference, and like I said, I hope it will not be the last. This is a matter in which we all, working in technology, I think we all have some sort of responsibility, to say the least, to flag this issue where we can with our employers and think of the things we do in our companies and in our technical roles. So thank you so much for joining us, Heather. And I wish you a lovely day.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So now we are in the community update section, Susanne. So who is the next?
Well, I think that